Hey, so y'all ready for another bedtime story? Because I sure am. I'm just going to tell you a little secret. I'm tired. I'm ready to go to bed myself. I'm ready to go get my PJs. So, tonight, we're going to do a little Cinderella. I've been avoiding this one. It's a little long, so yeah, I'm sorry. But let's get going. So, there once lived a young woman named Cinderella, whose natural birth mother had died when Cinderella was but a child. A few years after, her father married a widow with two older daughters. Cinderella's mother of step treated her very cruelly, and her sisters of step made her work very hard, as if she were their own personal unpaid laborer. One day, an invitation arrived at their house. The prince was celebrating his exploitation of the disimpoverished and marginalized peasantry by throwing a fancy dress ball. Cinderella's sister of step were very excited to be invited to the palace. They began to plan the expensive clothes they would use to alter and enslave their natural body images to emulate an unrealistic standard of feminine beauty. It was especially unrealistic in their case, as they were they were differently visaged. Oh man, that's a hard word. Enough to stop a clock. Her mother of step also planned to go to the ball, so Cinderella was working harder than a dog, an appropriate, if unfortunately speciest metaphor. When the day of the ball arrived, Cinderella helped her mother and sisters of step into their ball gowns, a formidable task. It was like trying to force 10 pounds of processed non-human animal carcasses into a 5-pound skin. Next came immense cosmetic augmentation, which it would be best not to describe at all. As evening fell, her mother and sisters of step left Cinderella at home to finish her housework. Cinderella was sad, but she contented herself with her wholly near records. Suddenly there was a flash of light, and in front of the Cinderella stood a man dressed in loose-fitting, all-cotton clothes and wearing a wide-brimmed hat. At first Cinderella thought he was a southern lawyer or a bandlander, but he soon put her straight. "Hello, Cinderella. I am your fairy godperson, or individual deity proxy, if you prefer. So, you want to go to the ball, eh? And bind yourself into the male concept of beauty? Squeeze into some tight-fitting dress that will cut off your circulation? Jam your feet into high-heeled shoes that will ruin your bone structure? Paint your face with chemicals and makeup that have been tested on non-human animals?" "Oh yes, definitely," she said in an instant. Her fairy godperson heaved a great sigh and decided to put off her political education till another day. With his magic, he enveloped her in a beautiful, bright light and whisked her away to the palace. Many carriages were lined up outside the palace that night. Apparently no one had ever thought of carpooling. Soon it was in a heavy gilded carriage, painfully pulled by a team of horse slaves, Cinderella arrived. She was dressed in a clinging gown woven of silk stolen from unsuspecting silkworms. Her hair was fastened with pearls plundered from hard-working, defenseless oysters, and on her feet, dangerous though they may be, she wore slippers made of finery-cut crystal. Every head in the ballroom turned as Cinderella entered. The men stared at and lusted after her woman, who had captured perfectly their Barbie doll ideals of feminine desirability. The woman, trained at an early age to despise their own bodies, looked at Cinderella with envy and spite. Cinderella's own mother and sisters of step, consumed with jealousy, failed to recognize her. Cinderella soon caught the ravening eye of the prince, who was busy discussing jousting and bear baiting with his cronies. Upon seeing her, the prince was struck with a fit of not being able to speak, as well as the majority of the population. "Here," he thought, "is a woman that I could make my princess and impregnate with the oh man, progeny of our perfect genes, and thus make myself the envy of every other prince for miles around. And she's blonde, too. The prince began to cross the ballroom towards his intended prey. His cronies also began to walk towards Cinderella. So did every other male in the ballroom who was younger than 70 and not serving drinks. Cinderella was proud of the commotion she was causing. She walked with her head high and carried herself like a woman of eminent social standing, but soon it became clear that the commotion was turning into something ugly, or at least socially dysfunctional. The prince had made it clear to his friends that he was intent on processing the woman, but the prince's resolution angered his pals, for they too lusted after her and wanted her for their own. The men began to shout and push at each other. The prince's best friend, who was a large, if celebrity constrained duke, stopped him halfway across the dance floor and insisted that he was going to have Cinderella. The prince's response was a swift kick to the groin, which left the duke temporarily inactive. But the prince was quickly seized by other sex-crazed males, and he disappeared in a pile of human animals. The women were appalled by this vicious display of testosterone, but try as they might, they were unable to separate the combatants. To the other women, it seemed that Cinderella was the cause of all the trouble, so they encircled her and began to display their unsisterly hostility. They tried to escape. Oh, she tried to escape, but her impractical glass slippers made it nearly impossible. Fortunately for her, none of the other women were shod any better. The noise grew so loud that no one heard the clock in the tower chime midnight. When the bell rang the 12th chime, Cinderella's beautiful gown and slippers disappeared, and she was dressed once again in her peasant rags. Her mother and sisters of step recognized her now, but kept quiet to avoid embarrassment. The women grew silent at this magical transformation, freed from the confinements of her own gown and slippers. Cinderella sighed and stretched and scratched her ribs. She smiled, closed her eyes, and said, "Kill me now if you want, sisters, but at least I'll die in comfort." The women around her again grew envious, but this time they took a different approach. Instead of exacting vengeance on her, they stripped off their bodices, corsets, shoes, and every other confining garment. They danced and jumped and screeched in sheer joy, comfortable at last in their own stiffs and bare feet. Had the men looked up from their macho dance of destruction, they would have seen many desirable women dressed as if they were for the boudoir. But they never ceased pondering, punching, kicking, and clawing each other until, to the last man, they were dead. The women clucked their tongues but felt no remorse. The palace and realm was theirs now. Their first official act was to dress the men in their discarded dresses and tell the media that the fight arose when someone threatened to expose the cross-dressing tendencies of the prince and his cronies. Their second act was to set up a clothing co-op that produced only comfortable, practical clothing for women. They then hung a sign on the castle advertising Cinderwear, for that was what the new clothing was to be called. And through self-determination and clever marketing, they all, even the mother and sisters of step, lived happily ever after. That was really hard to read. So let's go to something much easier. Back to Shel Silverstein. Literally, I picked a random page. A lot easier to read. So, Adventures of a Frisbee. The Frisbee he got tired of sailing to and fro and to, and thought about the other things that he might like to do. So the next time that they threw him, he turned there in the sky and sailed away to try and find some new things he could try. He tried to be an eyeglass, but no one could see through him. He tried to be a UFO, but everybody knew him. He tried to be a dinner plate, but he got cracked and quit. He tried to be a pizza, but he got tossed and baked a bit. He tried to be a hubcap, but the cars all moved too quick. He tried to be a record, but the spinning made him sick. He tried to be a quarter, but he was too big to spend. So he rolled home, quite glad to be a Frisbee once again. And as usual, Stay safe, stay healthy, still COVID-19 free. Have a good night, sleep well. Good night, everybody.